Hey guys, Ruben Lara here, and today I'm just going to talk over a little time lapse of me drawing various figures in perspective using just cubes and cylinders. This video is sped up about twice as fast as real time, so the whole thing took me maybe about 25 minutes. But yeah, this is an exercise I try to do as often as I can, just so I can keep refreshing my ability to draw basic primitives in perspective when I'm figuring out anatomical forms. Now, a lot of people might find this tedious or maybe, not even useful, but these are exercises, and a lot of people get frustrated as they struggle to learn anatomy and figure out what these shapes are of different skeletal structures. It's a lot to remember. And so trying to not only learn accurate anatomical volumes in addition to drawing them in perspective, it's a super challenging task and a tall order, and a lot of people just get frustrated and quit after a while. But learning to tumble basic cubes, spheres, and cylinders in 3D space is something anyone can learn how to do. And I'm always surprised at how much emotion and energy I can get with just these basic forms as well. If you haven't had a chance to check out my website, rubenlara.com/anatomy, I break down what some of these basic shapes look like at various angles. There's some 3D models you can tumble and spin and just kind of get to know. But if you can't tumble these primitive shapes in 3D space, how can you possibly expect to do it with much more complex anatomical volumes? You have to be able to learn this skill first, especially when you're dealing with things like foreshortening, like you're seeing right now with these legs kind of coming out. Being able to identify, how much of the cap of a cylinder we're seeing is so crucial to conveying, how these limbs are coming at us in space or receding or, bending and twisting. And really, these are the cages that I know I'm imagining when I'm roughing out, people at the sketch level. I'm not always drawing these cages for every single form I make. And certainly once you understand, what a rib cage looks like or, what an arm shape should be, you can start going straight to those forms in perspective. But whenever I get stuck, I always default back to these basic cages, especially when you're dealing with foreshortening and complicated poses. These simple shapes are what are really going to get you out of a jam and understanding how these things are coming at you or receding in space. Oftentimes I'll just create a new layer like you just saw me do with the head there, move it around, understand where it's supposed to be. Much easier to move around a box or even redraw a box than to have to continually keep redrawing, more complex organic shapes. And it just makes the process of building poses a lot less stressful because I'm just dealing with boxes that I'm happy to redraw whenever I need to. As you can see, sometimes I'll indicate the general direction of a gesture, like these arms, and then start blocking in these cylindrical shapes. I'll often find that I run out of space for the arms, and that tells me that maybe the torso is not high enough or needs to bend more. Again, redrawing simple cubes is always going to be less frustrating than redrawing anatomical forms any day. And this exercise can really turn into a lot of fun, honestly. When I'm starting these shapes, I don't even know what the pose is going to be oftentimes. But what I'll end up doing is kind of starting with that initial upper torso cube in some kind of pose. And you'll see as I move on to the next one. I think I moved these over on the page at some point. Even here, I'm starting to kind of try to put in some more concrete, pelvic shapes, but just opting for the simple perspective right now as an exercise. So going back to my original point, I'll often just start with this initial box for the upper torso, and that'll immediately kind of give me some ideas about where to hinge this kind of pelvic shape after that. Again, these are poses that I'm just making up out of my head and just having fun exploring and trying to work out, where these shapes might land. Of course, if you're dealing with a very specific pose, then there's a lot more clarity about where these shapes should be. But I'm always amazed at how much motion there is between that lower pelvic wedge and the upper leg. You can see a little dot that I put there right on the pelvis, indicating the rotation of that leg with that pivot point as it rotates all the way around the pelvis. Coming around to the head here. Trying to get that motion of the arm out. Another thing to note too is these shoulder spheres, right? Kind of describe this shoulder socket area. Has so much movement above and below and forward and backward to that main upper torso box. And that just goes to show how much movement there is in the scapula and collarbone mechanism. You can see on the first figure I did that sphere is way toward the back of the box, and now as this diving figure shows, those shoulder sockets kind of go up to the top left corner. It's a lot of range of motion. And this is what I'm going to hang anatomy landmarks off of to understand where those collarbones are hitting and where that rib cage is going to hit at some point. But working it out at this level, especially for more complex poses, is just crucial, for me at least. And I know that it's a much easier thing to learn for people who are just learning anatomy. Again, starting with that initial upper torso box, giving it some kind of direction. At this point, the head could go below or above it. I'm not sure yet. In this case, I'm putting that pelvic wedge underneath, a little bit of that trapezoid shape, moving it around. Already, you can get a sense of some kind of rhythmic emotion, right? We're getting a twisting of the spine there. We're going to be seeing under the pelvis here. We're getting a clear indication of what that perspective is looking like. And these initial cylindrical caps are setting the angle for these leg cylinders, pushing them out or pulling them or rotating them toward us in space. This one is rotating even more so. We're seeing a lot more of that cap. To note also, our pelvis, by and large, is quite in line with our upper torso. So whenever this leg is swiveling around, it's not that the whole pelvis is rotating. Our pelvis, if we're really flexible, can create quite the bend if you're a gymnast or a contortionist. But for most of us, that pelvis is only going to have a limited range of motion. But our legs, since they're on that ball and socket joint, can really swivel around. And to me, once I establish these basic cages in space, already we're getting a sense of what those muscles should be doing and how they're kind of wrapping around, leading from one mass to the other. These shapes are also helping me have a center line, a very clear, easy center line. There's that head kind of tipping down. Already I can decide, does it move over? Does it tip down more? There's a little indication of that thoracic and lumbar line of action. Again, here these arms are thrust forward. Now in this case, because I had drawn that right leg so forward and kind of forced that perspective into this wide angle where we're getting a really, a lot of distortion in scale, for such a small figure, right, between the pelvis and the foot. It's forcing me to also add that scale to the arms as they kind of push out into the distance, and the head as well. So, a lot of times these early marks are basically setting the rules for how large and how small these shapes get. And really that first upper torso box is setting the rules for how wide or narrow of an angle our camera is. And I would say something like our first figure is more of a narrow angle where there's less distortion. And then that bottom right figure is a more wider angle with much more distortion. Now, in this case, I'm starting with the pelvic wedge because I already had in my mind I wanted to do a figure that was on the floor, maybe kind of recovering from having fallen or having just fallen, I don't know. But this is, helping me in an angle that are challenging for a lot of people, right? Is how can we get that perspective under the pelvic wedge leading into these leg masses? Well, with these simple boxes, everything becomes so much more clear. And these shapes aren't necessarily describing anatomy. Yes, they're indicating some kind of volume, but they're more importantly helping establish perspective cages for the anatomy that goes in there. But I often find that they do double duty because I think it just starts to clarify any information you may already have in your mind about what these anatomical shapes look like. And we know what these shapes look like. We've been looking at people all our life. That information is recorded in our brain. We just have to kind of compartmentalize it, name it, and access it, put it in the right perspective. And a lot of this does turn into a little bit of that gut feeling the more and more you do it. I've really been encouraging artists to follow some of the exercises that I mentioned on my perspective page at rubenlauer.com/perspective. Google simple things like children's wooden blocks or Lego characters, minifig characters, and just take those images and trace them. Trace images of blocks on top of blocks, and a lot of these little baby toys are like that. The more you trace these shapes in space, the more you trace buildings, the more you trace primitive just primitive shapes, cubes and cylinders, the more your brain will start to understand and record and have just a gut feeling for how these shapes are tumbling in space. And the quicker you will start implementing any anatomical knowledge, you start to learn in tandem with these basic primitive tumbling. Well, I know that was a lot of rambling, but I hope that was helpful, just explaining a little bit of my process. If you haven't done this already and you're still struggling with anatomy, this is something you should be doing every single day. Do 2 or 3 characters wherever you are, on a sketchbook, on a napkin at a restaurant, while you're waiting at the dentist's office. Learn how to tumble primitive shapes in perspective. And I promise you, it will lay a strong foundation for your drawing skill set. All right, hope that was helpful, guys, and we'll see you on the next round.